You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. Happy New Year, all. I'm kicking the year off with the tale of vampirism at The Dark Castle by Marion Brandon, author of two strange tales of mystery and terror in the early 30s. This was Brandon's first published story, appearing in the September 1931 edition of Strange Tales. The spirit of Archenfels broods ominously over the two-stranded travelers in the deserted castle. I hope you enjoy it. The Dark Castle by Marion Brandon. Lost on a mountain road and out of gas. That worst possible combination of misfortunes for the tourist had overtaken us, worse than ever, with night now fallen on the unknown countryside around us, wrapping it in darkness, veiling the simplest objects in mystery, and endowing the most commonplace of sounds with sinister meaning. But there was no getting around the fact that the tank was as dry as the proverbial bone, and that no matter how Orescu and I cursed our luck, our car would never stir again until something could be procured to fill the empty gasoline tank. Nor was there any telling when that might be, for in the mountain districts of Central Europe, sources of supply are few and far between. Wrong directions had been given us somewhere on the way from the little city which we had left at noon, and instead of reaching the town that was our destination before sundown, here we were, hours later, nowhere, and unable to move. I was touring these remote regions with but one companion, a most likable young fellow, a Romanian who had graduated that June from the college where I was an instructor. We had formed one of the peculiar friendships that sometimes occur between an older man and a younger, and when the time came for him to return to his native country, he had suggested that I accompany him and make up a party of two for a summer of leisurely travel in such unfamiliar countries as Serbia, Bulgaria, and his own Romania, where we were at the moment when our engine died on that tortuous road. It was very cold in the high, clear atmosphere, for it was late in August and autumn was approaching. Not a sound to break the silence, but the eerie screech of an owl and the faint rustle of the night wind in the undergrowth by the roadside, like the stealthy prowling of some hostile animal. Though the entire day had been heavily overcast and dull, the night was clear and starry, but black as the pit, for the moon had not yet risen, and beyond the small range of our headlights we could see not a thing. "Well," I said resignedly, as I sat down on the running board and filled my pipe, "this may be very romantic, but it's cold too, and I'd give a good deal at this minute to be on a prosaic concrete state highway, with a red gas pump sure to turn up within half a mile." Orescu seated himself beside me. "It's only about an hour till moonrise," he said. "We can perhaps get some idea of where we are then. Hear that dog that's just begun to howl? Wonder whose death he's heralding." I have never blamed the originator of the superstition that the repeated howling of a dog means impending death, for it is the most depressing and ominous of sounds, doubly so at night, and it was beginning to get on my nerves when Orescu said in surprise, "We're looking for the moon in the wrong direction. I'd expected it to come up on the right, behind us. Look the other way." I obeyed. To the left the sky was softly golden, proclaiming the approach of the hidden moon, and throwing into bold relief the turrets and peaked roofs of a building. Not a light in it anywhere, not a sound, not a sign of life. But at least it promised some degree of protection from the penetrating mountain wind which was by this time going through our clothing as if it were made of paper. Releasing the brakes of our useless car, we rolled it backward down the slight decline of the road for the few hundred feet that lay between us and the tall open gates sagging heavily on their hinges. With a final effort, we pushed it through them, that the headlights might illumine the scene before us. The building was, as we had already surmised, a ruin, a small castle or very large house, its paneless windows staring like hostile eyes from the embrasures of the rough stone walls. Some of its turrets were broken, like jagged teeth, others seemingly intact, all darkly outlined against the rapidly brightening sky. As we gazed, the golden rim of the moon rose above it. The shivering screech of the owl trembled through the chilly air, answered by the dismal howl of the distant dog. A scene of such unearthly desolation may I never behold again. "Looks pretty solid at the right-hand end," Orescu remarked after we had examined it as fully as was possible from the distance at which we stood. And arming ourselves each with an electric torch, we approached the building. The huge iron-bound door sagged open like the gate, and, passing in, we found ourselves in a great stone-floored hall, roofless and chill and forbidding. At the right, however, a doorway opened, beyond which we discovered a smaller room in fair condition. It was but a single story high. The strong black beams that supported the ceiling were all in place and looked as if they would stay there. Boards had been pushed against the paneless windows, half-burned logs lay in the gaping stone fireplace, and in a corner of the room was a pile of dry wood. "Not at all bad," said Orescu, surveying the scene approvingly. "Others have camped here like ourselves, made arrangements for a longer stay, though, and apparently changed their minds. But the wood they didn't burn up will come in nicely for us. I'll build up the fire," he went on, "while you start carrying in the rugs and food." The moon had by this time risen high enough to render a torch unnecessary out of doors, its greenish-silver radiance making the world almost as light as day. We were well prepared for camping out, with plenty of warm rugs, cans of soup, coffee, bread, bacon, and, fortunately, candles. As I went out for my last load, I was startled to find, standing by the car and gazing toward me, a woman. She was enveloped in a long, dark, hooded cloak which so shrouded her form and shadowed her face that I could form no idea of her age, though the voice in which she addressed me, in German, had the clear, vigorous ring of youth. I could see only that her eyes were very bright, and her teeth remarkably fine and white between the scarlet lips that parted with her smile. "Pardon," she said, "if I have startled you, but I live nearby, and strangers seldom come this way." I expressed my surprise that people lived near, since I had seen no lights, and suggested that she could perhaps find us a warmer lodging for the night. "My home is hardly large enough," she replied with that flashing, brilliant smile. "I came only to look, this time, but I shall perhaps see you later." And as I gathered a few more articles from the back of the car, she wished me good night and hurried away with sure steps down the dark road. "Fine," Orescu said when I reported the encounter. "Perhaps they have a small farm where we can get eggs for breakfast and something on 4 legs to hunt gas with." Orescu was of a decidedly domestic turn, and by the time that he had spread a couple of our heavy travelling rugs on the floor by the roaring fire which he had built, and which was already having an effect upon the chilly atmosphere, stuck a candle at each end of the heavy stone chimney-piece, and set our camp coffee pot on a brick to boil. He had found a well just outside. The ruined room looked almost cozy. Yet, for some unfathomable reason, I felt nervous and edgy. I would gladly have strangled the distant owl and the more distant dog, each of which, at irregular intervals, continued to emit its eldritch lament. Just as I would think that they had knocked off for good, one or the other of the eerie sounds would break out through the night, and the miserable dog seemed to be coming gradually nearer. A couple of bats flitted blunderingly about the room. The night wind prowled uneasily outside. "I've always heard that you Central Europeans were a superstitious lot," I remarked as Orescu, whistling cheerfully, set the finished coffee aside to keep hot and placed over the fire a generous pan of bacon. "But here we are in what might be the setting for all sorts of horrors. It gives even me the creeps, and for all the effect it has on you, you might be fixing up a midnight mess in a college dormitory." Orescu sat back on his heels. "I'm just as superstitious as the next person, when I have reason to be," he replied in a perfectly matter-of-fact manner. "But plain creepy surroundings don't disturb me in the least when I know there's nothing wrong." "How do you know there's nothing wrong with this place?" I asked curiously. "You never saw it before, did you?" "Never." Orescu placidly arranged the crisp, hot bacon between slices of bread and poured the coffee into enamel cups. "But there is only one haunted place, a vampire castle, in this entire region, and it's on a road leading out of the other side of Koslow from the direction we took this noon. There's nothing else within 100 miles that's credited with even the mildest of spectres." "And you really do believe in the supernatural?" I demanded incredulously. "You wouldn't sleep here if the place were called haunted?" "My good friend," said Orescu, for the moment unwontedly serious, as he turned his dark eyes on mine. "It seems strange, I know, to a native of the great super-civilized United States that supposedly intelligent people can believe the unbelievable. That is, unbelievable from your point of view. But, after all, the powers of darkness love the dark. And isn't it only reasonable to think that they shun the more civilized and populous regions of the earth and cling to the remote and little-known places? Granted that the idea of a spectre or spirit seems preposterous to one sitting comfortably in his modern, well-lighted home or driving along a traveled highway. But if you were told that this was haunted, would it seem so ridiculous?" The sinister howl of the dog, nearer beyond all question, answered him. "Knowing that it isn't," he added, "I'm as happy as I'd be in the finest of hotels. But if this were Archenfels, you may be certain that I shouldn't be here." And as we devoured our hot supper, this astonishing young man whose American education had not shaken one whit his belief in supernatural manifestations told me the story of the vampire castle. "It's 20 miles out in the mountains, to the west of Koslow," he said. "Hasn't been lived in for over a century. It had been for hundreds of years the perfectly peaceful home of a noble family who had to abandon it 120 years or so ago, when it suddenly became vampire-haunted, for no reason that anyone could think of. First, the eldest son and heir was found dead in his bed. Then his brothers, one after the other, at considerable intervals. After the original owners got out in despair, a few attempts at living in it were made by others who hoped to get a fine estate at little cost, but it was just the same. A series of mysterious deaths. Always men, too, young men, never a woman. Grin as much as you like, he reproved me, but in every case the same little sharp wound was to be found in the throat of the victim. Nobody has knowingly spent a night there in over a century, as I have said, he went on, but now and again a traveller has done so, as we are doing here, and always with the same dire result. The finding of his body, sometimes long afterward, the throat marked by that cruel little wound. No one lives near it any more. Its only neighbours are the dead in the churchyard of an old ruined church. No, Professor, he finished with his engaging young smile. If this were Archenfels, I should be running now with a speed that would surprise you. As it is, in our cozy spot with neighbours not far, I shall sleep soundly, and I wish you the same." With that, he wrapped himself in one of our extra rugs, lay down by the fire, and with his coat for a pillow, fell asleep almost immediately. I suddenly felt very lonely. But though I tried my best to follow his example, it was of no use. The fire was burning low. The bats, joined by others, still blundered among the wavering shadows. The rising wind moaned outside as it tried one window after another. The last howl of the accursed dog was surely much nearer. I shouldn't have drunk that coffee so late at night, shouldn't let my mind play with the boy's ghastly tale of the ruined castle, haunted by those hideous visitants who are said to feed upon the blood of their living victims. Suddenly, as I lay staring at the dying fire, my heart seemed actually to stop, then to race thundering in my ears. Icy sweat crept out upon my body. Though I had heard nothing, I knew that something, was in the room, advancing soundlessly upon us from the doorway behind me. With a desperate effort, I fought down the engulfing terror that had laid hold on me, and turned my head. Coming slowly toward me across the room, in the fitful glow of the failing fire, was the woman who had spoken to me at the gate. But how terribly, how awesomely changed! The long cloak had been cast aside, revealing a white gown of olden fashion. The face, shadowed before by the dark hood, exhibited a strangely bright pink and white quality that was not human. The lips, red as blood, were parted in a mocking smile. Her fingers were claw-like, and suggested the talons of a bird of prey. And the eyes! I could not, heaven help me, remove my own from the baleful gaze with which they fixed on me. They fascinated me, like the eyes of some deadly serpent. I could neither move nor speak. I lay inert, paralyzed and cold. "Welcome to Archenfels," she said, smiling a terrible smile of derisive triumph. "It has long lain untenanted, and I have had to go far afield. Archenfels, the castle of dread repute. Paralyzed as my body had become, my brain was clear as I groped frantically for an explanation of the horror. Archenfels, Orescu had said, was to the west of the city. We had gone east. Impossible. Yet as I stared into the narrowed, cruel eyes of the scarlet-mouthed creature whose sharp teeth shone white in the flickering light of the fire, I knew that it was not impossible, knew that there are indeed more terrible things in the world than man dare dream of. Some of the country people of whom we had asked directions had doubtless given wrong ones, and with the sun overcast as it had been all day, it had been easy enough to lose our sense of direction and circle around, simple enough to understand now when it was too late. Frantically, I struggled to break the hold of those awful eyes. Sweat streamed from every pore, yet I lay inert as a log. Not a movement could I make, not a finger could I lift, nor could I, by the most desperate striving, remove my gaze from hers. If I could do that, something told me, the spell would dissolve. I might attack her and perhaps save our lives. But can the sparrow look away from the beady eyes of the snake gliding toward it? All this time, Orescu lay sleeping as quietly as a baby, one arm over his heart, the other thrown out upon the coverlet, his slow, regular breathing the only sound in the room. A heavy graveyard odor of damp earth and decay stifled me as the creature came closer, stepped past me, but always facing me, never taking those terrible eyes from mine, knelt by Orescu and, gathering his slumbering form into her arms, bared her shining teeth. As she paused, still holding me chained by that unwavering gaze. I thought in blind revulsion of a tiger crouching over its prey, glaring jealously, lest another beast interfere. Disturbed from the deep sleep of youth and health, Orescu opened his eyes. For an instant he stared, blankly and uncomprehendingly, as if in a nightmare. Then over his handsome young face swept a look of stark frozen horror that I shall see in my dreams till my last day. Under the very window the dog suddenly howled, long and despairingly. I think that the boy died at once from shock. I hope he did, for when I realized to the full the appalling thing that was about to occur, a thing which I cannot even now put into words, I felt that I too was dying, and merciful unconsciousness overcame me. After what seemed an eternity of struggling, submerged in blackness, I won back to consciousness, confusedly aware of a white form slipping out through the door. Weak and dizzy, I sat up. The room was still. The fire had sunk to a few sullen embers. Even the wind had died, and I, thank heaven, was no longer in the grip of that nefarious gaze. Snatching the torch that lay beside me, I turned its beam upon the crumpled young figure by the hearth. No need to look a second time, to feel the pulseless wrist. The terrible, unearthly pallor of the boyish face, the ghastly, drained greyness, was enough. Boiling rage seized upon me. Where had the foul creature gone? To find others of her kind and tell them that a living man still survived in the accursed castle, material for another grim feast? Demented and without plan, I rushed out into the night. Across the lawn, plain in the clear green moonlight, a white form was passing through the great gate. I dashed after it in mad pursuit as, realizing that it was followed, it fled, fleet as the wind itself, down the rough mountain road. Never once did I raise my eyes from the level of its fetus. With bursting lungs I labored after the flying shape. Not again would I fall a victim to that dread gaze. I was almost upon it when it suddenly veered to the left. Unable to check myself, I ran past the little gate in the stone wall, thus permitting the monster to gain time. Halting as quickly as possible, I turned and rushed through the gate, into a graveyard. Yes, there were the fluttering robes before me, silver in the moonlight, the streaming golden hair. With a final mighty effort, temples pounding, pulses throbbing, I gained upon my quarry. No more than 20 feet separated us when it suddenly stopped, laid hold upon an ancient slanting tombstone, and vanished into the earth. Sick with horror and utterly exhausted, I dropped beside the grave, and for a second time that night, and the second in all my life, a wave of unconsciousness swept over me. When I came to myself, the stars were paling before the rosy light in the east. Cocks crowed in the distance, birds twittered in the trees. Lame and stiff, I struggled to my feet. I was standing in an old cemetery, disused apparently for many years. The aged, lichened tombstones were canted drunkenly this way and that. The ruined little church was half hidden in overgrown shrubbery. All as poor Orescu had described the fateful region, had we but been able to see. For some reason, I drove a little stick into the grave at my feet. Her home was indeed small, and hastened back along the road to the dire castle of Archenfels. Here I found many people grouped around our car, all talking excitedly, but in hushed tones and pale with fear. Others were within. As I entered the room of death, a tall old priest rose from his knees beside the body of Orescu, now decently arranged, with eyes closed and hands crossed. We both spoke German, and the priest told his story. A small farmer, living across the valley from Archenfels, had seen our lights in the night, and had, at first peep of dawn, hastened to the village to report what could mean but one thing: another tragedy. Practically the entire population had accompanied him to the castle to find what they had feared, a new victim of the vampire. They had deduced that 2 people had occupied the room, and upon my explaining where I had been, the priest's dark eyes lighted strangely. "Sir," he inquired eagerly, "do you know where she disappeared?" "I do indeed," I answered. "I marked the spot." An incomprehensible look flashed from face to face among the listeners as the priest translated my reply, and one woman, with tears streaming down her cheeks, knelt and kissed my hand. "I think, sir," said the priest slowly, after he had given some directions in his own tongue to several of the men present, "that, shocking as this experience has been for you, you have been the instrument for saving the countryside from a great fear. I will explain to you as we return to the graveyard." The priest's story tallied closely with Orescu's, with a grim addition. The victims of the attacks were, as the boy had said, always men, young men, a fact which doubtless accounted for my own survival. But during the 100 years that the castle had stood untenanted, the number of young men who by chance spent a night there had been insufficient to satisfy the creature's bloodlust, and now and again some village lad would be found dead in his bed, a sharp little wound plain in his throat. The last victim, 2 years before, had been a son of the woman who had kissed my hand, and as she had 2 other living sons, her fear had been great. None but the dead had ever seen the destroyer. No description had ever been given, no theory could be formed as to its sudden origin in so peaceful a district. The village had taken such steps as it could. The few graves of suicides and others who had died violent deaths situated outside the graveyard wall beyond the consecrated area had been opened long ago, for such unfortunates were said sometimes to become vampires. But the rotting coffins had contained nothing suspicious, only the mouldering bones that would be natural. And one cannot open all the graves in an old cemetery with no clues to go on. Long beams of morning sunlight were stretching across the dewy grass when we arrived at the one that I had marked. Helena Barrientos, read the almost obliterated inscription upon the stone. Died August 5, 1799. Aged 20 years. For a time we waited there, the people behind us all silent under the solemn spell of impending strange events, until the men to whom the priest had spoken his orders returned, some with picks, shovels, and ropes, and one with a long, strong stake sharpened at one end. A lad carried the processional cross from the village church. Amid a deep, strange silence, they set to work, the pile of fresh black clods rising rapidly beside the excavation. Then came the dull sound of blows upon rotting wood. The hole was made wide and deep enough to permit the workers to descend into it, the earth carefully cleared from around the coffin, too frail with age to bear removal from its place. The lid was loosened, lifted off. Cries of horror rose from those crowding around the grave. As for me, my brain reeled. Even then I could not believe my own eyes. Lying before us, in the decayed old coffin, with the fresh rosy colouring and scarlet lips of a child asleep, was the terrible visitant of the night before. But now everything terrible about her was gone. The eyes which had exercised their dread power of fascination were quietly closed, the red lips pressed together. A corpse, fresh and bright as the living, where should lie a heap of disintegrating bones. "You see," said the old priest simply. A little metal box lay beside the body, and this he opened, disclosing a letter written in faded but still legible ink. Slowly and solemnly, he read it aloud. I confess to God, but not to man, that this my daughter met her death by her own hand. I wish that my child, wronged and mistaken though she has been, shall lie in consecrated ground, for I fear that she will not rest outside. For a day after her death I told others that she was grievously ill. Then that she had died. I prepared her for the grave myself, and none suspect. May God forgive her. She had much provocation, having been heartlessly betrayed by the young lord of Archenfels, though I alone know. May God forgive me too, her mother. Amid a profound hush, the priest folded up the tragic message from a long-gone day and let himself down into the grave. The sharpened stake was passed to him. Grasping it in his right hand, he received in his left the shining brass cross. Even I, stranger and skeptic though I had been, had heard tales of the grim method of exorcising vampires, and I held my breath with the rest as we watched. Murmuring a Latin sentence, he raised the sharpened stake. "May God have mercy on your soul," he said, and plunged the point into the heart of the body before him. A gasp of mingled relief and horror rose from all who could see into the grave. In the winking of an eyelid, the corpse vanished. Only a disintegrating skeleton lay in the coffin in a pool of bright red blood that was running rapidly out through the cracks and soaking into the rich black earth. "May God have mercy," said the priest once more, in the sonorous rolling Latin of the church, and with infinite compassion in his tone. "Amen," answered the people, and went their ways. That is all. I remember but little of the trip back to the ancient city of Koslow, where I spent nearly a month in the hospital, delirious much of the time. When I had recovered enough to study a map of the region, it was easy to see how we had wandered into the fatal neighborhood. The road on which Archenfels stood left the city in a westerly direction, it is true, but soon bore decidedly south, while ours, going east at first, also bent south before very long. The wrong direction given us had put us on a road that joined the two, and our own wanderings had done the rest. If only the sun had not been hidden. If only we had reached the dread spot before night veiled the scene. The college granted me leave of absence for a year, and I am somewhat better now. But my hair is white at 40, and I know that never again shall I have the nervous balance of a normal human being. The doctor said that it might help me to write it all out, get it off my mind in a measure. I think that it has helped, and I feel too that if the recital of my experience brings others to the realization that there are still dark and terrible things to be encountered in this commonplace world of today, and restrains them from speaking or even thinking lightly of them, I shall at least have accomplished something of good. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,